Hi everybody and welcome to Mark Overanalyzes Film. Today I will be overanalyzing one of the most mesmerising films of the last few years, Aftersun. I wanted to overanalyze Aftersun for a few reasons. First and foremost, it is brilliant. Secondly, it's one of those films that as I watched it, I had to wonder, how on earth does this actually work? In some ways at least, it feels so lilting and so languid that you wonder how it keeps an audience engaged, and yet I was totally invested throughout. Thirdly, I'm going to come back and talk about this much more later on, but when studying 2001 A Space Odyssey for this podcast, I came across an interview with Stanley Kubrick where he stated that he explicitly aimed to take us on a journey that would bypass our conscious minds. Aftersun is, of course, very different to 2001, but it does share something in this. It shares a third act climax in particular that relies on a highly expressive, purely cinematic expression of its central idea. And after both of those films, I left the viewing experience feeling like deep down something inside me fundamentally understood what I had just seen, even though consciously I couldn't explain it, which is fascinating. But, of course, this is exactly why I have a podcast called Mark Overanalyzes Film, because why would I just allow myself to feel something when I could spend hours and hours figuring out exactly how it works and why it would have that effect on me? So, I end up coming back to the two fundamental questions of this podcast. What exactly does this film mean, and how does it go about meaning it? Keeping that in mind, first I'm going to look at the fundamental features of our protagonist. Second, I'll show how the story tells us what it means by looking at the main story beats and the sequences of the film. And finally, I'll talk about the main things I learned along the way. Okay, so first things first, just who is our protagonist? I don't think it's a straightforward answer. Callum drives much of the story, and young Sophie has her own objective, as we'll see. But really, I think the main tension, what this film is really about, belongs to adult Sophie. However, that being said, normally in a film, the protagonist has a want and a need. The want is the tangible objective that drives the second act of the film and provides the overall tension throughout the long middle of our story. Basically, in most films, the hero will begin a journey or adventure of some kind around 25-ish minutes into our story, and that journey will come to an end about 20 minutes before the end. And this is what defines our second act. But obviously, adult Sophie is not really around enough to provide a consistent, tangible objective or attention on a scene-by-scene or sequence basis. So, for my money, the want probably belongs to Callum. Now, I could be completely overreaching here, but at minute 17, Callum has a phone call with Sophie's mum. And this, to my mind, triggers Callum's spiral across the holiday. We don't know what is said on the other end of the phone, but Callum has a slight and slightly desperate laugh as he says, "That's wonderful, I'm so happy for you." So it sounds like Sophie's mom might be moving on in some significant way, and that must be a tough thing for Callum on at least some level. And then he immediately turns around to see Sophie pushed up against the glass watching him intently. He cannot give away even a hint of a moment of sadness or rejection or whatever he might be feeling inside. In the very next scene, we then see him drinking for the first time. And I think this is the main tension that provides our three-act story shape. Will Callum be able to control his demons and keep Sophie from seeing them? But this is a coming of age story as well, of course, so I do need to point out that Sophie has her own objective for Act 2 that shapes her story. At the very same moment that Callum is on the phone to her mum, Sophie is spying intently on a couple of teenage girls as they talk about sex. It will be her objective to individuate herself from her father and hang out with these teens. Finally, and at least as importantly, we have the need. So, the want is some kind of tangible objective that drives Act 2, but the need is the human truth or piece of wisdom that the protagonist lacks at the beginning of the story but learns by its end. It's something internal, psychological, or even philosophical. It will change the protagonist deeply, and as the protagonist is the audience avatar, the fact that they change, most of the time, and come to believe a piece of wisdom to be true tells us that we should believe it too. That's how a film, or any story really, makes a thematic argument. And there's probably any number of ways that you could interpret the need here or attempt to put it into words, but for my money, adult Sophie uses three things to try and connect with Callum as an adult: the camcorder footage, her memory, and her imagination. But the devastating truth of Aftersun is that we can never truly understand the loved ones we lost too soon. Adult Sophie goes on a journey in this film to try and stop or reverse time to connect with a father she couldn't really communicate with, but her need goes unmet, and she is left knowing that all she can do is miss him and grieve her father's absence. That is the thematic argument of Aftersun. And on that cheery note, let's have a look at the acts and sequences of Aftersun to see how it tells that story. There are traditionally, but not always, 3 acts and 8 sequences or stages of a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes or so, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question. Now, again, I have to say Aftersun is interesting here because while it's definitely very subtle in its particular sequence tension, it provides a very clear sense of sequence structure by using the individual days as chapters or episodes. Okay, so Act 1 has our first 2 sequences, and the first one is always pretty much life as it is. And here our first sequence is mostly our day 1. But of course, first we have some really important setup. In a film like this, where much of the events feel so low stakes, I suppose, at first glance, it's important to introduce a broader tension. And I'm going to take a moment to go through this in detail because it's all very brief, but highly evocative. The first thing we see is camcorder footage of 11-year-old Sophie asking her dad what he thought he would be doing at his age when he was 11 like her.
Wait, I was going to interview you.
Where were you? What were you going to interview me about?
I don't know.
No.
Well, I turned 11 and you are 130, turning 131 in 2 days. So, when you were 11, what did you think you would be doing now?
And if you watch very, very closely, as Callum's face literally darkens, we can see a faint silhouette of a grown woman watching this on a screen before she reaches forward and hits rewind. This then is the scene that triggers everything. At that, we cut to an unusual strobe-lit rave scene, and we focus on a woman, adult Sophie, standing in the middle of a dancing crowd with her eyes squeezed closed. We then see what we will discover to be the end of the camcorder footage, the moment when young Sophie said goodbye to her father, likely for the last time. The camcorder footage rewinds more fully now through an entire holiday, and the adult Sophie on the dance floor opens her eyes with determination. At that, we cut to young Sophie with her dad Callum on the bus in Turkey. So it's going to be a long time before we understand what all of this means, but we have set up our 3 methods of connection: the camcorder footage, imagination, and memory. But it's really time we got into the narrative proper. So we see father and daughter share a silly joke together on the bus before arriving at an empty hotel lobby. And it's here where we get our first hints of where this story is going. Callum moves to go looking for someone before wondering if he should leave Sophie alone. And Sophie senses this before he can even express it and tells him she's fine. So he's obviously a little inexperienced in the day-to-day of being a father thing, but they have a really nice kind of trusting rapport. But then there's the other tension in this story. As soon as she's alone, Sophie grabs a clearly adult book and starts reading it. The moment she hears Callum coming back, she shoves it back down and tries to look as innocent as possible. Then, when they get to their room, we have the first of many setbacks for poor Callum during a holiday that just appears dead set on diminishing his paternal authority. He ordered a room with 2 beds, but they only have 1, and he is powerless to make anything happen about it. But there's also a few things to note here for later on. One, at the end of this first sequence, Callum tucks in a fully clothed, passed out Sophie, which is going to be completely inverted later on when Sophie covers up a buck-naked Callum in the same bed at the end of Act 2. 2, we then have the first sign that there's something at least somewhat eccentric about Callum as he goes out onto the balcony at night, lights a cigarette, and waves around as if dancing but using Tai Chi moves or something. 3, Sophie and Callum share the bed, which is a thematic signifier of how close they are as father and daughter at the start of this story. They will never share a bed again. Now, to my mind, there is a very short sequence 2 here, though it is notably longer in the screenplay where Callum and Sophie hang out in their hotel on day 2. Unfortunately, the hotel is under construction, so Callum now has a problem, and we wonder some version of the tension: will he find a solution to the fact that he has booked them into a building site? And so, they do have fun in the pool, then he brings Sophie for ice cream, and then for a swim in the sea. Eventually, though, we will find them hanging out in another hotel, and that is the answer to our sequence tension. But before that happens, there's one more moment that foreshadows issues ahead. On only the second night in Turkey, Callum is staying up into the middle of the night watching the camcorder footage. Why he's doing that, we can only really imagine. It's probably that he's kind of, concerned about that Sophie thinks he's a good dad, but we don't really know. And this behavior of staying up late will mean that he is exhausted throughout, which will lead to many of our problems in the story. But anyways, our sequence 2 tension has been answered, and so at that, as far as I'm concerned, we end Act 1 and we enter Act 2. Now, there's a lot to say right here. First of all, at minute 15, this is unusually early to be starting a second act, and if you read the script, you might notice that this phone call home scene looks like it will come in at around minute 22, which is kind of a more normal time for that kind of thing. But more importantly, we have to consider what really gives this film its 3-act shape. And this is where we introduce our 2 clear Act 2 objectives for Sophie and Callum. So first, when Callum speaks to her mother on the phone, Sophie goes to the bathroom and we see her far more engaged now than we have up to this point. And why? Because there are 2 teenage girls nearby talking about sex. And Sophie is clearly desperate to understand what they are talking about. From this moment on, she will be attempting to hang out with these teenagers whenever she can to try and learn from them. Second, back in the phone booth, Callum gets some news. We don't know exactly what it is, but it sounds for all the world like Sophie's mother might have gotten engaged or is planning to move in with someone. Or who knows, maybe she just got a really big promotion. No matter how you slice it though, you can hear the checked emotion as he tells her that he's so happy for her, and then immediately has to turn around and put on a smile for an intently watching Sophie. And you might notice that it is in this next scene where we first see him getting a drink. The first of many that he has throughout Act 2, whilst trying to stop his inner demons from coming to the surface and ruining Sophie's holiday. Just like Sophie's objective, this will come to a head at the end of this act in about 60 minutes' time, but unlike Sophie, he will abjectly fail in his objective. But there is more. Our third sequence, or the first of our second act, always begins by basically telling us what the second act will look like, and you can see loads of stuff here that subtly defines our second act. The teenagers are introduced, Callum starts doing Tai Chi and drinking during the day, there's distance and subtly building tension now between Callum and Sophie, the film has introduced a new location that it will return to throughout the act, and Sophie soon meets Michael, a boy her own age. All of these things are introduced between minutes 15 and 18, and they tell us so much about what is coming. But let's focus for now specifically on sequence 3, which we can broadly categorize as the first attempts to solve the problem. So for Sophie, she dismisses Michael pretty quickly and then uses her dad to make first contact with the teenagers. When they put money down to play pool, she offers to play doubles rather than just play a game with her dad, which is unfortunately another micro rejection for poor Callum to deal with. From there, she is able to impress them by actually being very good. But more importantly, the real tension of this sequence for my money is the question, now that Sophie's mum appears to be moving on in some way, will Callum and Sophie address it? And in considering this question, this is really where we have this sequence's defining attributes. In a sequence 3, we always have a kind of retrenchment away from the need first, and then eventually we have the first unconscious move towards the protagonist's need. And so, unfortunately, the retrenchment is when Sophie muses that as long as she and her dad share the same sky, it's like they are together.
I think it's nice that we share the same sky.
What do you mean?
Well, like, sometimes at playtime, I look up to the sky, and if I can see the sun, then I think about the fact that we can both see the sun, so even though we're not actually in the same place and we're not actually together, we kind of are in a way, you know?
It's so clear that Sophie misses her dad terribly, but at least she has this to console herself. But we know that she will not always even have that. And so this retrenchment eventually gives way to the first unconscious move, which also answers our sequence tension. At minute 27, in a brilliantly visual scene, Sophie tentatively raises the idea of her parents hypothetically being together, and Callum flat bats it.
I remember one time I asked Mum if she had phoned you, and she said that you were engaged. Like, I didn't know why, but I thought that meant that you were getting married, like, both of you. Like, I didn't know if I thought that about Stu or both of you, but... Isn't that funny?
Oh, did you thought we were engaged?
Well, I didn't know what it meant at the time. I didn't know that it meant that you were just on the phone to somebody else.
But there's so much going on here because Callum is also inadvertently hurting himself while this is going on as he tries to take his cast off. And the two characters are now separated by a wall on screen, with Sophie bathed in warm yellow and Callum covered in dark blue while he stoops down over a bucket. Now, one more note on this. This moment is considered an unconscious move because it's a sign of where we're going, but it's not intentional or deliberate or pre-planned. And so it's worth noting here that Sophie has casually brought up the idea of somehow returning to a past where her father and mother were likely together, and the hope of it has been denied to her. At the same time, Callum, in attempting to cut off his own cast, has accidentally cut himself and is now bleeding. It's all unconscious or not thought out, but it's an ominous sign of where we will end up. So, our sequence 3 tension has now been answered, and it's time we entered sequence 4, the greater attempts to solve the problem. And here I must admit I struggle to pin down a really clear tension that has a clear moment of being resolved or answered. But that being said, the next 11 minutes all takes place in one day, day 5 I think, and I think we can sense that Callum is really struggling now. And I'm wondering some version of the question, will Callum be able to control his inner demons and stop himself lashing out in some way? Now, I say that because this is the sequence where Callum goes diving, and it begins with him giving Sophie the cold shoulder because she let some goggles fall into the sea. Then he sends her away, and he forebodingly tells the diving instructor that he can't see himself at 40. In fact, he's surprised he made it to 30. This foreboding feeling of tension is maintained when Sophie begins recording herself pretending to be a reporter, but ends up having to unconvincingly reassure herself that her father is going to be fine deep sea diving. And this moment where young Sophie first seems somehow perturbed with her father's mortality then leads to our first return to adult Sophie's rave scene, where the young woman lays eyes on her father across the dance floor. And soon we're about ready to answer this sequence's tension. And that means it's about time for what I consider to be our all-important midpoint. Now, the Platonic ideal of a midpoint does several things all at once. 1, it should generally raise the stakes of our story. 2, it should foreshadow our eventual climax. But most importantly, 3, it should contain the protagonist's first conscious move towards their need. So here we've been wondering whether Callum will lash out or break down in some way. And then, just as all appears calm, we have our most troubling incident so far. Lying on the bed, Sophie tries to explain how she feels.
Don't you ever feel like you've just done a whole amazing day and then you come home and feel tired and down and feels like your bones don't work, they're just tired and everything is tired, like you're sinking. I don't know, it's weird.
We're here to have a good time, eh? Ready?
Now, there's a lot to get into here. First, this answers our sequence tension because Callum has finally lashed out in some way by suddenly and violently spitting at his own reflection. Second, notice how the first unconscious move had him accidentally drawing his own blood in the bathroom, and the first conscious move has him in the same location deliberately spitting in his own face. Third, this moment is so shocking and abrupt, it raises the stakes for what's to come. Fourth, and I apologize here if I offend anyone, I am a certified non-expert to talk about this kind of thing, but it's kind of hard not to when you're talking about Aftersun. There is a subtle suggestion here of the eventual climax. At the end of our film, in 51 minutes' time, we will see that in Sophie's imagination, Callum appears to have no control over his own body before he falls away from her. And in this moment, where it feels like Sophie may be describing the early hints of depressiveness, she talks about how it feels like her bones don't work and like she's sinking. And also, this is such a troubling act of self-hatred, it subtly but strongly suggests the act that we never see in our climax, the likelihood that Callum took his own life. Fifth, to my mind, Callum hates himself in this moment because he is just now realizing that he has passed on his mental health issues to his daughter, and you might notice that both Callum and Sophie are looking at each other through reflections. The visual filmmaking is telling us at Aftersun's midpoint that yes, these two are reflections of each other, they are connected, but they are separate from each other. They cannot see each other directly, either in this moment or in our true resolution. But right now, Callum understands how Sophie feels, and finally, eventually, Sophie will understand how he feels, but by then it will be too late to share that with him. It is a phenomenal, poignant, and deeply sad midpoint and piece of filmmaking. But at that, we've answered sequence 4's tension, and we've had our midpoint, so it's time for sequence 5, the honeymoon sequence. Now, the honeymoon sequence is so called because normally the protagonist has made a move towards their positive need, and they are kind of rewarded for it, so things kind of seem to be going well. But of course, Aftersun is more naughty, complicated, and sadder than that. So let's just say that this tends to be a sequence that strongly foreshadows where things are going to end up. And so, here in the honeymoon sequence, Sophie and Callum separate. Sophie begins to come of age by hanging out with teenagers. Callum, now alone, buys a rug and touches it to try and feel connected. And Sophie appears to become increasingly aware, or at least explores, her burgeoning sexuality. So, it's at this point where we see Callum become entranced with the carpet that will one day end up under adult Sophie's bed. But it's also at this point where Sophie takes a huge leap out of childhood and into teenagedom. She asks to play pool with the teens, they invite her along, and Callum is now left behind. What follows is just a ton of great visual filmmaking. Sophie throughout is consistently drawn to one teenager in particular, Laura, and whether that's because she looks up to her or because she has, burgeoning sexual feelings for her or some combination of the two, it's hard to say, probably even for Sophie. So, when Sophie joins the teens, she's staring at Laura's earrings before we see her own unpierced ears. And then the film introduces the idea of Laura's wristband. It allows her to get anything she wants. Laura is young, carefree, and financially comfortable. All the things that Callum is not, or at least feels he's not. Then Sophie sees two teens aggressively shifting in public, and they soon all jump in the pool and start pairing up. And Sophie notices Laura's bra, now visible under her wet top. In the next scene, Sophie begins wearing her swimsuit under her dress as she hangs up both her own clothes and Callum's, and she considers a stirrer she's picked up in the form of a shapely naked woman. So again, we can see all through this honeymoon period, Sophie is suddenly really pushing towards an adulthood so far unseen in her. But we have arguably still got the most important element of this sequence to come. The first thing we saw in this film. Both back in their room, Sophie now attempts to interview Callum on camera. And this is almost certainly the point in the tape that adult Sophie began with, because it is the only time throughout the whole film that Callum's face is actually recorded. And as soon as Sophie asks him about his own childhood, Callum shuts the camera off. And this is one of those moments where the cinematography is doing so much thematic storytelling. As Callum answers Sophie's question about his 11th birthday, the focus shifts from his reflection in the mirror to the reflection on the TV. The fact that the focus lands on this blank TV screen highlights that Sophie does not have this recorded, that this is only in her memory. And what's more, in the moment when she had this moment with her father, she was far too young to understand the weight of the story or to be able to fully connect with him. She can only respond with, "That's a bit deep." From here, the two do soon have their warmest moments together though. They spend the night in, they play chess, and Callum seems to predict correctly that Sophie will not stay in Edinburgh when she gets older. But right at the end of our honeymoon sequence, there's an effect that again foreshadows where we're going. Throughout the scene, Blur's Tender is playing, and then begins to slow and warp. As it does, we cut to adult Sophie in the rave, and for the first time, she looks away from her father dancing. Then the camera slowly zooms back from their hotel room's front door. Now, in the screenplay, it's clear why this happens. Once Callum puts Sophie to bed, he goes out, smokes, drinks, goes clubbing, and hooks up with Belinda, the tour guide they've been making fun of all holiday. But we only get a vague sense of this in the film, and then we see the ramifications of it. The following morning, we find him standing precariously atop the balcony railing for no good reason. And then we see a tense breakfast where he looks exhausted and on edge. It's safe to say there's a sense of issues coming home to roost, so at minute 58, we enter sequence 6, the bridge from the honeymoon to the low point. And this sequence is really just a disaster for Callum. There's a clear tension in the air now, and we wonder some version of the question, will Callum be able to keep it together when he's this on edge for the day? He's moody at breakfast, then tries to overcompensate by getting Sophie to play water polo, which does not suit her. The tension is palpable all day, and soon it comes to an awful head. Sophie signs them up for karaoke, and Callum pretty much emotionally abandons his daughter. He is so clearly ashamed of his own weakness in this moment, but takes that out on Sophie by telling her that they can get her singing lessons if she wants. And then Sophie absolutely cuts him to the core.
Big up Wells for Sophie!
Down you come, please. Here you are, Lucy. Right down here. Take it away.
You know, we could get you singing lessons if you wanted to learn to sing.
Trying to tell me I can't sing?
No, I'm just saying anyone can learn if they put in the work.
Stop doing that.
Doing what?
Offering to pay for something when I know you don't have the money.
Then, in a mannerism that is so like the one that he made in the phone booth earlier on, Callum tries to laugh it off. But he can't because Sophie is having none of it. He tells her to call it a night, but she refuses. So, with his daughter now furious with him, and rightly so, Callum returns to his room alone and totally stripped of his paternal authority, while Sophie hangs out with a bunch of teenagers while they get drunk. And you can hear it, right? Callum is now failing to stop his demons from ruining his daughter's holiday, and Sophie is getting to hang out with the teenagers. Their respective pursuits of their objectives are coming to a head, and so we are coming to the end of our second act. And so, Laura now takes off her yellow wristband and gives it to Sophie, giving her some financial independence and a broader sense of freedom that comes from becoming a teenager. At the same time, Callum is on his own, watching his daughter's camcorder footage, and he is overcome with shame. As soon as Sophie has taken on this signifier of teenagedom of the wristband, she has her first kiss with Michael, and then observes two people of the same sex kissing in secret. Callum, meanwhile, gives in to his worst impulses and marches drunkenly down to the inky Black Sea, and we fear the worst. Eventually, Sophie is let back into her room by concerned hotel staff, and she now has to cover up Callum's buck-naked body in bed. She has become the adult, and this is what triggers us seeing Sophie in her own home as an adult for the first time. At that, her journey of change is over, and our second act is complete. Now, I should point out, I call the end of the second act the low point of our story, and the reason for that is because it is generally the moment in our story where the protagonist no longer believes the counter-argument of the story, but the argument seems impossible. In other words, they've changed from the way they were at the beginning of our story, but they don't know how to truly embrace the lesson that they have learned. So let's take our three characters here. Callum has been unable to keep his demons at bay, but the holiday is not yet over, so he is going to have to live with the shame of that. Young Sophie has come of age and began individuating from her father, but she has been given the wristband because Laura is leaving the following morning and she is staying with her father. And adult Sophie has gotten close to her father in her imagination, but now hears the desperation in his breathing. In the present, she plants her feet on the rug that he left behind, a tangible record of their time together, but we will see that she cannot help but try to connect with him in her imagination. So you can hear it, right? The characters no longer believe the counter-argument, but the argument seems impossible. And so at that, we end Act 2 and we enter Act 3. Act 3 has a false resolution and a true resolution, and in our false resolution, Sophie and her father have a lovely day together and seem to reconnect. They go on a day tour, and here in the false resolution, Sophie copies her father as he does Tai Chi. They move smoothly and deliberately in perfect sync together, which is going to tragically contrast with our true resolution. Then Callum opens up slightly emotionally as he apologizes wholeheartedly to Sophie. And then we have possibly the most heartbreaking moment of the entire film. 23 minutes ago, Callum abandoned Sophie to sing alone on a stage in front of a group of strangers. Now, Sophie shows her incredible strength of character as she rounds up a group of strangers in an amphitheater to sing "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow" to her father. But this only appears to trigger the true depths of Callum's shame, as we cut from him looking down on this with a darkened blank expression to him sobbing uncontrollably on his bed.
And so say all the world, and so say all the world. Hip hooray! Hip hooray! Hip hooray!
Sophie and her father will not stay in sync, and Callum tragically can't deal with the shame that he feels is compounding on him from his behavior. And so at that, it's time for Aftersun's devastating true resolution. Callum and Sophie have a chilled out last day together and then go for dinner. And again, you might notice that now in our third act, Callum is once again not drinking. And I don't know, there's something about Paul Mescal's performance in this scene in particular that is so striking for me. He's quiet and he's genuinely happy when Sophie says she wishes they could have stayed longer, but you can just see there's this deep well of sadness that has been brought really near to the surface and is just under wraps. And then it's time for Aftersun's brilliant climax. Sophie and Callum get back to the hotel in joyful spirits, and Callum begins to dance to the absolute pitch-perfect choice of Under Pressure. And this is the scene for which Aftersun will be remembered, as young Sophie reluctantly but delightedly dances with her father. Adult Sophie finally makes it across the rave to Callum and attempts to stop his incessant moving. But as young Sophie pushes him away in embarrassment while he hugs her, adult Sophie screams at him to stop dancing and tries to hold a clearly tortured Callum tight. But adult Sophie cannot settle him, and as soon as Callum stops moving, he falls away, as if his bones have stopped working and he's just sinking. And as Queen and David Bowie sing the words, "This is our last dance," all adult Sophie can do is watch him fall and look around to find herself alone. finally, we join adult Sophie in her apartment, and we realize that she has been watching the camcorder footage all this time. As her baby infant cries in the background, the camera continues to pan right past her and back around to Callum as she would have last seen him. He closes the camcorder and walks through double doors into the rave, a place in her imagination where she can never quite reach him, never quite connect with him, and never provide him with the peace and the succor he so desperately needed. Well, as I have made it this far without crying, I'd like to talk about two related things in particular that I think make Aftersun so special. The first is basically how Aftersun actually works as a story. It took me ages to figure out how this film functions, and that's mostly because I really struggled to find these, really tangible sequence or act tensions. However, while it is true that this film is very subtle and so much of it is more internal and emotional than most, there are basic story mechanics put in place to structure the piece. So, first of all, the individual days often serve as sequence markers, so while the sequence tensions are subtle, the audience can feel some kind of clear sense of closure, progress, and build. But secondly, more importantly, there are actually several plots that all have their own tensions and their own progressive beats. So, A, we have Callum trying to keep his demons from affecting Sophie. He has a break into Act 2 when he gets some news on the phone from Sophie's mum about her moving on, then a first unconscious move when he accidentally hurts himself in the bathroom as he flat bats the topic of him and Sophie's mum getting together. Then he has a first conscious move when he spits at his own reflection, when he realizes that Sophie has likely inherited some of his mental health issues. Then he goes drinking after being interviewed about his own childhood. Then he has a low point when he abandons his parental role and duty altogether and goes swimming while drunk. Then he has a climax where he has one final nice memory with Sophie and a resolution where he disappears from her life. B, we have adult Sophie trying to stop her father incessantly dancing. We only see her 5 or 6 times, but as you can see, it's actually a classic 5-act structure. At minute 3, she goes looking for her father in the rave. At minute 35, she has a first unconscious move as she sees Callum dancing far off in the distance. At minute 56, we have a first conscious move that foreshadows her climax as Sophie gets closer to Callum but finds herself looking away in pain. At minute 75, we have a low point where Sophie seems much closer now, but Callum's breathing sounds desperate. At minute 90, we have a climax where Sophie tries to stop Callum dancing but can't as he eventually falls away from her. And at minute 94, we have the devastating resolution as Callum walks out of her memory and into an imagination where she can never quite reach him. But we also have smaller plots, like C, Sophie trying to get in with the older kids, and D, her peer Michael trying to catch Sophie's attention. And these mini plot story beats also provide a sense of shape to the story. Sophie meets Michael 3 times, once at the very start of Act 2 where she beats him, once right before the midpoint of the film where he earns some of her respect and acts more like an equal, and once at the end of Act 2 where they have their first kiss. It's a beginning, middle, and end for their story together. Similarly, Sophie meets the teens with her dad at the start of Act 2. Then in the honeymoon sequence, she uses that cachet to hang out with them with Callum's reluctant blessing. Then finally, she hangs out with them because she and Callum have had a falling out. But at this point, she would probably really rather be with her dad, and while she gets Laura's wristband, it's only because she's leaving. There's also something else to note. We initially don't know why Sophie is remembering this holiday, but we know it must be important, and so we sense something ominous. So again, you might notice that at the start of Act 2, we introduce a very small 2-beat plot E. Callum watches an adult physically dominate a child and tries to teach Sophie to defend herself. And this introduces a tension in our head. And so, at the very end of Act 2, as an unsupervised Sophie wanders around lost late at night, a hand suddenly comes from behind her and covers her mouth, and we fear the worst. But thankfully, this is not that kind of story, and the hand turns out to belong to poor young Michael, who is trying and failing at all times to be cool in front of this girl. Michael, I have been there. I am so sorry for you, kid, but, don't worry, maybe someday you'll have a podcast about films or something. So, while Aftersun does not have the most obvious overall structure, we can see it's actually chock-a-block with plots, or at least setups and payoffs that all follow textbook story shapes. But while that may be catnip for a story structure nerd like me, that is, of course, not what makes a film great. In my view, what makes Charlotte Wells' Aftersun a masterpiece is that she is using incredibly evocative cinematic storytelling as a means of expressing the emotions and internal lives of her characters. And this is what leads to a feeling that only films can give you. Aftersun is so powerful and devastating, even though if you asked me what I had just seen as I walked out of that cinema in 2022, I couldn't really tell you. You sense that you know what just happened, but you can't put it into words. You feel it, but you can't explain it, because it's emotional, it's pre-verbal, it's subconscious. I knew Callum was dead, but I never saw him die. There's some magic in the fusion of that rave scene with Sophie's memory of dancing with her dad in Turkey, and how under pressure meshes and melds with something much darker and more ambient. And there's something so evocative in seeing Callum dancing from far away, only to slowly realize that this is not something joyful. This is compulsive and uncomfortable. Dancing and movement seems to have been a release for Callum, a coping mechanism. But what if he simply could not cope anymore, and incessant dancing was something his anxious mind compelled him to do because it simply would not stop? Callum moved through life in pain, and adult Sophie tries to settle him down, to soothe him, but she can't. She hugs him as tight as she possibly can, but he is still prostrate with anguish. When Callum finally does stop moving, he falls. She can remember her father, she can feel his skin and smell his sweat, but she cannot reach him. And the gap between those two things, with loved ones that have left us too soon, is a source of grief for us all. Roger Ebert described cinema as an empathy machine, and Aftersun is a pure example of that idea. Sophie never tells us that she lost her father, but we know it. She never tells us that she misses him, but we feel it. The deeper Charlotte Wells went inside herself to convey a feeling too fundamental and profound to be fully expressed in words, the more she connected with us all. That is the power of storytelling, and that in particular is the true power of cinema. That's why Aftersun is a masterpiece. This has been Mark Overanalyzes Film on Aftersun. If you enjoyed this episode, please do recommend it to anyone you know who might like it too. It really would be a great help. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.